Thank you so much for tuning into my show, William Wallace for America. If you're watching the video portion of this, you're going to see some signage in the back. If you're listening to the podcast, please check it out on YouTube and Rumble at William Wallace for America. In the video, you'll notice I'm with a friend of mine who's been on my show before, John Skurridge. John, thank you so much for being on today. I really appreciate it.
Bill, always a pleasure.
Well, you know, John, for those of you who don't know, is one of my political buddies. And we've done political shows before. And talking to John, I guess actually you told me this about a year ago. You said, I got something I want to talk to you about. And I thought it'd be politics. And then I found out it's about Lafayette.
Yeah.
By a gentleman with the last name of Lafayette, which we'll go into detail here in just a second. I wasn't really interested in the event as much as I was hearing more about Lafayette. So in this interview, you're going to hear somebody who is key to American history, which is why I'm bringing it to you on my show. And then throughout, you'll hear about an event that's celebrating Lafayette, but I think you're going to love the historical part more, and if you love the historical part, you're going to want to know about the event also. But tune in here because this is going to be some great information you didn't know that saved America and protected our freedoms by a gentleman known as Lafayette. John, is that true?
That is absolutely true. We are about a month away from a major event here in New Orleans and as well as in Baton Rouge. And when I say New Orleans, that includes St. Bernard Parish, Chalmette, all the way up the river to Baton Rouge. We are celebrating the bicentennial, the 200th anniversary of the historic visit of General and the Marquis de Lafayette's visit to Louisiana. It was part of what turned out to be a 13-month, 6,000-mile tour where Lafayette visited the then 24 states in the Union. So at that time he was invited by President James Monroe to visit the United States. It was a formal, and not only from the president, but it was a formal invitation by Congress, because at that time there was a belief that American patriotism was starting to wane.
Which president, which number was Monroe?
Monroe should have been the 8th president?
Okay.
Right. But and Monroe had actually was an officer during the American Revolutionary War. And
I'm tying it together. So we're going back
so
8 times 4, almost 32 years later after
right.
Lafayette was originally here.
Right. So he was a junior. Monroe was a junior officer. Many of the members of Congress in the U.S. government at that time were veterans of the Revolutionary War. So as it turns out, Lafayette, by 1824, is the last surviving general from the War for Independence. So it was, when he came here, it was nothing short of rock star status. In fact, they talk about the fact that about 8,000 people, mostly screaming girls, welcomed the Beatles at JFK Airport. 40,000 people turned out to welcome Lafayette as he entered New York Harbor.
So they realized how key part he was, or how much of a key part he was to Americans' history, but to our freedom. But let's go back to the original time when Lafayette came here. This is a story you shared with me that I absolutely love. The historical part of this, I think, is significant to the listeners because on this podcast series I'm doing, where I'm doing some history, I got some other ones coming up here too on some other events that happened in American history that are key. So when Lafayette first came here, how did that happen? What was the reason he came here? Let's go for that.
Well, and I know in a little while you said you're going to take some good shots of these panels. I love these panels because they basically these 6 panels tell the story of Lafayette. And here you have it's a young kid. He's only 19 years of age. It's 1776. He hears about this war for independence and liberty by the British colonists. So immediately, he was the son. His father was a military general. His entire upbringing was through military
in
schools.
France.
Right, in France. He's very wealthy. He's a marquis. He has 2 estates. His ancestral estate in south central France was the Chateau Chavignac. And then he married into a very wealthy aristocracy family. His wife, Adrienne, they had the estate just outside of Paris, which was Lagrange, as we Americans say, Lagrange. So all the cities in America, in any state named Lagrange, it's named after, in honor of Lafayette, of his estate, about an hour east of Paris. So between these two estates, his income is in the area of $30 to $35 million a year.
And is that today's dollars?
In today's dollars.
Oh, wow.
So he's a very rich young man, high ranking in the aristocracy. Marquis would be the equivalent of Duke, so way up there.
Yeah.
And he decides he's going to give that up, risk his life to come across the Atlantic to help join the American cause. So he does the appropriate thing. He goes to King Louis XVI, who we all know in later years what happened to him.
Yeah.
Right. So he goes to Louis, so he says, Your Majesty, I'd like your permission and blessing to go help the American cause. And Louis's response is, absolutely not. You are not going to drag France.
So let's pause there for 1 second. What was freedom like in France at this time? So we're talking about a monarch.
It's
we're
a
talking about
monarchy with aristocracy set up.
So the people did not have the freedoms. They had an aristocracy or monarchies, but they did not have the freedom that we have in America, nor did they have the spirit for freedom like Americans do, or did at the time.
By comparison now, I mean, obviously the British colonists didn't feel like they had many freedoms, otherwise they wouldn't have revolted, But compared to today, no, France, being a citizen in France, would have been no different from living in Great Britain, because you're under a monarchy, even if in some cases, if you had a constitutional monarchy, nevertheless, you have a monarch and you have an aristocracy.
So now we're in France. He is in not monarchy. He's a duke, and so he's got some significance, if you will,
Right.
over there. But he recognizes that the little people, don't have the freedoms that the Americans fought for when they broke away from Britain.
Correct.
And so he's observing all of this, and he doesn't have to worry about his freedoms. He's got money, he's got power, but something wells up inside of him to go to the king at the time and say, "Hey, I want to go help the little people over there."
Right. Well, France is probably the birthplace of the concept or this notion of liberty. That's the birthplace. And many in the aristocracy felt like more rights and privileges needed to be given to the common class. That's how, as a young man, he was very idealistic. In fact, he would remain extremely idealistic till his death in his 70s. But he wanted to do something. Now, part of his family's history was his father was killed in the Seven Years' War with Great Britain. So, you're a young man, you've been trained for nothing but military all your life. You're 19. You're raring to go. I mean, you're looking for a battle, and the fact that he loves the idea of the concept of liberty that the British colonists want to create for themselves. Plus the fact that his dad was killed by the British,
right?
So it may be a little bit of a payback factor.
Exactly.
So he goes to the king. He does the right thing, and of course, Louis XVI slams a door in his face, and so he was very quiet in his reaction, but the king suspected he was probably going to just ignore him, so they put sentries around Lagrange in the estate. They kept an eye on him because they had a feeling he might ignore the king, and he did. So legend has it that Lafayette dressed in women's clothing. He was asked this during his tour in 1824 and 25, and he adamantly rejected that. He said, "No, I did not dress in women's clothing to escape." But the legend has it that he did. But he commissions his own ship with his own money and sneaks out of France. And that's no understatement. He had to sneak out. He arrives near Charleston on the shores and immediately was taken for a British spy. And as he said, can you imagine? He says, how many British do you know speak with an extremely heavy French accent? You know, but eventually he makes his way.
Because he spoke perfect English too?
Now, in fact, that was a question that I had to research. He did not know any English when he departed in sneaking out of France. He learned from some of the sailors on the boat, on the ship all the way across. So in a matter of a month or a few weeks, he had learned enough English to at least communicate effectively. There is a miniseries on Apple TV that Michael Douglas, that's excellent. He plays Benjamin Franklin. And there is a very well done scene, historically accurate, where someone made arrangements for Lafayette to meet Benjamin Franklin. And Lafayette was going to Franklin to arrange a meeting with Washington. He wanted to meet George Washington. So the scene is very well done, where the young man is tall and lanky and slender like Lafayette was. And Benjamin Franklin asks Lafayette, well, the king, Louis, right? He's all on board with this. And Lafayette says, no. And he says, well, at least your family, you know, because Franklin was very knowledgeable of all the aristocracy in the families. He said, at least your family is on board with this. And he goes, no. So Benjamin Franklin just candidly asks him, do you have any idea of what you are getting yourself into? And because at that time, France, King Louis XVI did have an emissary. He sent General Rochambeau, who was the top general, you know. And so, but Rochambeau's relationship to the American cause was really as nothing more than an observer and to report back to Louis XVI. So at this point, Franklin arrives, you know, or Lafayette arrives in Philadelphia. Franklin makes the arrangement. A few days later, he meets George Washington.
So how does Lafayette get through that he's not a spy? You know, I interrupted you there. So he gets off the boat. I
think by the time he got to Franklin, they figured he was legit. Franklin knew it. He was very familiar with both the Lafayette family and his wife Adrienne's aristocracy family. So by that time, I think he had finally got through the screening process and was introduced. And of course, according to the writings, and it's even depicted in letters, that many of the letters that Lafayette and Washington wrote back and forth to each other, even after the Revolutionary War, was that Washington really didn't want to do anything with Lafayette. Lafayette wanted to fight. He wanted a field command.
Well, I'm going to stop for one second. Okay. What's interesting here is what I want the listeners to really understand here, and I'm going to highlight it, if you will, underline it, double underline it, is Lafayette gets off the boat, okay? You're in where you said?
Near Charleston.
Charleston, South Carolina. Right. You know, it's not like he can text George or Ben and say, hey, you know, off the boat, LOL, you know, smiley face, emoji, you know, whatever. Where are you? On my way. Get an Uber and get to him right away.
Right. At this point, Washington doesn't really even know Lafayette exists.
Well, but my point is, this is not only a journey of days, it's a journey of weeks. Where do you sleep when, you know, it's not, there's an interstate system, you know, so from Charleston to Philadelphia to get to meet Benjamin Franklin isn't like, hey, are you going to be home in a couple of days?
Well, remember, he did have money and means.
Well, he does. He does. But even money and means, you have to say, I'm getting on the dirt road. I mean, because that's all you have is dirt roads.
Right.
You know, you got to know which dirt road to take.
Coaches. Right.
Coaches.
You
got to know somebody who knows the dirt road. I mean, it's not, there's an interstate system, and your days on the road. It's not like you can get on there and do 75 miles an hour. You know, 70. Sorry. And
it was several weeks by the time he got.
So they're
from South
traveling
Carolina
down dirt roads to meet Benjamin Franklin. Okay, so this is something that I want to highlight, because Lafayette, when he chose to help Americans fight for freedom and chose to help George Washington, this is like, I've heard of this guy, George Washington. He's leading the fight for freedom. I want to fight for people's freedoms. You know, the part of it is like that, vinegar, we'll say, inside of him. And part of it is, wanting to fight for freedom. And to know at that time that, like today, you want to fight for freedom, you enlist, you go get, army, whatever, and you're instantly in an organized army. He's got to know that what he's thrown himself into is traveling, trying to find, it's not easy. But he does it out of his passion for freedom and America.
Well, he did know who George Washington was. So
he knows. So he knows but how to get to
him.
He
knew the end goal
key.
of who he needed to get to.
Right.
So Franklin arranges everything. Washington meets Lafayette, and immediately he wants to fight. He wants a field command. He's been trained for it. Of course, Washington's not about to give him this, because, as Washington said in some of his letters, the last thing he needed, at least as far as especially trying to establish and get a relationship with France and get France into the war, the last thing he needed is for this young aristocracy, nobleman, to get killed. So he basically just gives the term they use, aide de camp. Aide de camp. He's an attaché. He's a secretary, assistant under Washington. And of course, throughout in the months ahead, as battles and fights began to take place, Lafayette was just chomping at the bits. He wanted to fight. But within a few days of meeting Washington, he signed, and I think we've got the card. It's on one of these where he signed the pledge of. It was the pledge, a card, and it still exists, that he signed his allegiance to the Continental Army. So
Lafayette did.
Right. Okay. He signed a card.
Did he sign that in the presence of George Washington?
Yes, in the presence of George Washington. So he's now working under Washington. So finally, though, there were, and those of you who are listening who are true historian aficionados of this, I'm taking liberties. I'm jumping. You have to, because this could be a 5-6 hour discussion easily, and we wouldn't even get past the Battle of Brandywine. So, I mean, you've got to jump and take some liberties.
Nor will we have time to get to the event that's coming up in New Orleans and all over America.
Because I always have people say, well, that wasn't exactly correct. I said, yes, but you can't. When you narrate stuff, you got to be fast, and you got to take some liberties. So, we come to, there's a lot of skirmishes and battles confronting the British. And eventually, it led to the Battle of Brandywine, which was a major altercation. And Lafayette realizes Washington's losing his left flank, so he wants to run and grab men and go. And finally, Washington just said, "Go." Put me in, coach. Put me in, coach. Put me in, coach. Exactly. Go. Just go. And he fortifies the flank and stops the British. So, matter of opinion who actually won Brandywine, but the bottom line is the British did not. And so the American forces held their own. So, but of course, what happens in the battle? Lafayette gets shot. He is shot in the leg. At first, it's not thought to be serious, but he probably nicked an artery, which could kill you. You bleed to death. So he quickly grabbed one of the battle scarves he had, and he just wrapped his knee with it and just continued on. Later, Washington, of course, put his top surgeon and said, make sure this man lives, nothing happens to him. So he survives, he comes back, and of course, we jump ahead where you see here the Virginia campaign, which was where Battle Brandywine was, and he was commissioned as a major general, and here, of course, comes the siege of Yorktown. And I learned early on, it's not the battle. Yorktown was a siege. It wasn't a particular fort. It was a small town in which the British built these reinforcements of bunkers around the town of Yorktown. And they were referred to as redoubts. And of course, it's a famous battle where Lafayette, by this time, Lafayette and Hamilton become, Colonel Alexander Hamilton become very close. So when it came down to the final siege, the strategy, it was really, Lafayette had a major role with Washington in the tent, mapping out the battle. He asked for the command, for the lead command into the battle. But Hamilton, who was only a colonel, was the ranking field officer for battle, and he asked for it. So out of courtesy, Lafayette, deferred to him. But it was really much of the strategy that they mapped out was a lot of the thinking and planning from Lafayette's thinking. So what ended up happening is Lafayette took an all-American brigade and led that on Redoubt 10, and then Hamilton led an all-French brigade to Redoubt 9.
That's interesting
Yeah.
because Lafayette was the French one.
Yes.
So you would think it would be opposite. Hamilton would have had the American troops, and Lafayette would have had the French troops.
But I guess that was one way of showing
So
diversity.
French had help there by then. So
Right.
at what point did France send help?
Well, it was probably within the year leading up to 6 months where Rochambeau reported back to Louis XVI and said, this kid who disobeyed you is making progress. And just maybe if we get involved and help to the level they need, I think these crazy colonists can actually pull this off. So that is when it was Yorktown when finally the French arrived in the level of troops, money, and especially their navy to make the difference. When
See, Americans forget about this. We always think that the French need our help,
Yeah.
but the French were there for us at the beginning.
No, and I'll divert for a second. One of the ways I even got involved in this, people said, "How did you get involved in doing all of this?" We visited Colonial Williamsburg, which I agree with them. It is the birthplace of our nation. There's a lot of towns, Boston, that claim that, but I agree because it is in Williamsburg where rebellion was first uttered. So to me, they get dibs on right. And that's when the governor dissolved the Burgess, and they went over to the Raleigh Tavern, and they were in the Apollo room in the back, which I've been in, which is the hairs on your arm stand up when knowing that you're in the room where they first said we must rebel and become our own independent country.
And what was that? Where was that again?
Where that's at Colonial Williamsburg.
And what was the room?
Oh, the Apollo room, which is in the Riley Tavern, which is right up the street from the what was the verge of the House of Government. So here you've got this rebellion taking place. They can't do it on their own. I am on the street, Duke of Gloucester, which is the main drag down the center of Colonial Williamsburg, and I'm talking with they call, in Disney World, they call their people cast members. Well, in Colonial Williamsburg, they're known as nation builders. And these are living, breathing actors who impersonate our founders. And they are the historical living embodiments of these famous people from history. And I am talking with a young Colonel George Washington, the gentleman and his name is Daniel Cross, and he's phenomenal as George Washington. I am standing with him. It's a casual conversation like this, just him, me, and two or three other tourists. And he's telling us about everything that how difficult it was to mount a rebellion, because very few people know this. They talk about our founders as being these rich old white guys. Well, nothing could be farther from the fact. The average age of our founders was 27. Patrick, give me liberty or give me death. Patrick, 26. Thomas Jefferson at that time, 28, 29. Yeah. George Washington was the old man at 39. Now you had Ben Franklin up, but they were young people. Remember Monroe, all these, James Madison, they're all young officers. Exactly. John Adams is only 30. So and their wealth was on paper only. And that was the key, what brought up the key question that got me involved in learning more about Lafayette in France. He's telling me how you didn't have currency. There was very little currency. This is how the monarchy in Great Britain kept their foot on the throat of the colonists. If you don't have a lot of currency to exchange, you can't afford to mount an army and start a war. So I asked the question. I said, well, how did people do exchanges, financially? He said they would cut coins. The jeweler was very busy, kept busy. They would take silver and gold coins, and they would cut them into pieces of 8. So you would exchange these little wedges of the coin. He says, all your money was on paper across the Atlantic in the Bank of England. He said, you had land, you had farming, so you would exchange goods and services, but you really didn't have monetary currency wealth. So I asked the $1 million question to Colonel George Washington. I said, then how in the hell were a bunch of colonists able to finance and put on a revolutionary war? The guy, Daniel Cross, who plays Colonel Washington, stepped forward to me and he says, I'm going to answer your question, but I have to break character to answer it, because the George Washington that I portray would not yet know the answer to that question. He says, the answer to your question is France. We owe France everything. Without France, he said, we would have never been able, not even come close to defeating what was at that time the most powerful military force on the face of the earth in Great Britain. So he says, we owe France everything. And I said, wow, I need to learn and read up more on, I've always heard that, but I don't know the details. And he said, go right up the street. He says, right behind the Riley Tavern at the theater, in a little while, you're going to hear a guy come and speak to you, the Marquis de Lafayette. He says, and he can tell you more about what France did. And that led me to meeting Mark Schneider, who plays Lafayette, and who, by the way, will be down all 5 days at our events next month, for our bicentennial.
For a brief moment, just for 1 minute, the event in New Orleans is when?
April 9th. Events are every day from April 9th through, which is Wednesday, April 9th through Sunday, April 13th, which, by the way, coincides with the same days of the French Quarter Festival. So it's going to be packed. It's going to be packed. It's a blessing and a curse. So I got to know Mark, and when I asked Mark, I emailed him to his email address at Colonial Williamsburg. And I said, look, Mark, there's a lot of books on Lafayette. Do you recommend one? He did. He recommended Professor Giles Unger, just like Felix Unger with the Odd Couple. And his book is just simply titled Lafayette, and you can get it on Amazon. And he was right. He said it's written like a novel, but it's very historically accurate. It's not as boring and stuffy as some textbook novels are. So I thanked him for it, and he said, well, if you're really enjoying this, he says, you need to get in touch with this guy by the name of Chuck Schwam. He is the national director of this historical society. It's been around for about 100 years, called the American Friends of Lafayette, which is what I belong to, and you can see my pen here. This is what you get when you join and become a member of the American Friends of Lafayette. So I joined, and I called Chuck, and he says, where are you? And I said, I'm in New Orleans. He says, oh, that's great. He says, we had this thing going on. It's going to last 13 months. It's a bicentennial year of celebrating and commemorating Lafayette's famous visit to the United States in 1824 and 1825. So I asked the stupid question. I said, great, well, who do I get with and talk to? He goes, you. He says, you're the only member we have in Louisiana. You're like our first member. So I foolishly say, yeah, I'll do it. I'll see what I can do to put on this bicentennial. So at that point, all I knew, and we're talking, this is like the holidays of 2023. And all I knew is that they've had these events, I've read about it, where as Lafayette travels around the country, not every city, but in most cities or towns or villages, they're going to do this by 200th anniversary reenactment, sort of what it was like when Lafayette visited.
So this is basically for this celebration, the event, and we're going to go back to the Lafayette story here in a second. this celebration event that's coming on in New Orleans that I'll post a separate video for and separate advertisements for is really to recreate when he came back to America during
Right.
the President Monroe, when he
Exactly.
came back to America to do his
Nation's guest. He was the nation's guest. He
The
was the
nation's
first
guest.
ever by Congress designated as the official guest of the nation. And
to
do
come
this.
back and do the Lafayette tour.
Right. Supposed to be 3 months in just a few states. Well, that quickly turned into 24 states, 13 months, 6,000 miles.
That's quite a tour back
Yeah.
then, because even back then,
Right.
there's no interstate system. He's back
you
on the
don't
dirt
have
roads.
telephones. You
Yeah.
don't have text
Hey, I'm
messaging.
on my way,
Right,
kind
exactly.
of thing. You show up.
It's amazing and impressive how they were just able to coordinate it and pull it off.
Well, again, it's like when Lafayette got off at South Carolina in Charleston, and he travels for a week or whatever it was to get to Benjamin Franklin. He's lucky that Benjamin Franklin wasn't on a ship someplace else, because there's no way to communicate. Hey, are you in town? I'm on my way. I'm gonna be there next week. The same with George Washington. You kind of know where they're at, but you travel days.
Exactly.
And again, this goes back to a testament of his passion for freedom and to be able to do this. But even bigger than this goes back to divine. This goes back to
Divine providence.
Divine
Right.
providence. This
Yeah.
goes back to that shows you that
This 19-year-old kid he decides not to get involved. Maybe France never does get involved to the level that the Continental Army needed them to get involved, or they get involved too late where the entire cause for American independence
he gets a divine
fails.
spark to come
Right.
over here, tells King Louis, up yours, I'm going anyway, even if I
Exactly.
do have to dress like a woman to do it,
Right.
Or whatever.
Sneak
We
out.
don't, And so now we're at the Battle of Brandywine, Battle of Yorktown. They win these battles.
Finally, at that point,
How much time has gone by at this point? He's come over here. He reaches South Carolina.
Well, September 1781 is Yorktown. The war did go on for a few more years, but even Washington knew that it was just a matter of time. Once Cornwallis was defeated and the French was involved, all the British could do is just bide their time. And they dragged it on for a little long, but eventually they succeeded. The victory, and we won. And all in this time, Lafayette now is rising to prominence as a military hero. And his English improved. That was one of the requirements that Washington had of Lafayette. If he was going to have a command, he had to have a good command of the English language, which he did.
Wait, you mean he couldn't press 2 for French?
Right.
He had to press
Exactly.
one. He could only press 1 for English, right?
Right. So that's right. There was no second languages. English was unofficially the official language. You had to speak English. So he and Washington become extremely close. Washington, many times at dinners and banquets, introduced Lafayette as his adopted son. In fact, when they finally left one another, Lafayette did briefly go back to France, spent maybe not quite a year, had a son with his wife, Adrienne. She herself is a fascinating story. If you look, you hear the term sometimes describing women as a strong woman. You talk about a strong woman. She was a very strong woman, and I'm going to give an example in a minute or two about that. But so she goes back. They have a son. His son, their firstborn child, is named George Washington Lafayette. So he comes back finally a year later. It was to a hero's welcome in Boston. In fact, the ship he returned on, that's famous. We would say Hermione, but it's Hermione. And the Hermione. It was a famous documentary on PBS a few years ago where it took 7-8 years. They decided to rebuild it. Some wealthy Frenchmen got together, some Americans, and they painstakingly worked several years to recreate, to authentically the Hermione. And it's in dry dock right now, but it's been over to the United States several times in the 15, 16 years since it was built. But he arrives on the army back in Boston to a hero's welcome, gunfight, cannons, everything. So he spends a few more years with Washington, and when he finally departs Washington for the last time, right as Washington's beginning soon his presidency, he tells Washington, he hugs and kisses him and says, "Please do not forget your adopted son." That's how close they were. So then what happens? He goes back to France, and what begins there? The Reign of Terror, where they begin killing and executing the aristocracy. Adrienne lost everyone in her family except herself.
His wife.
Yeah. So at this point, in the letters they are writing back and forth, Washington tells Lafayette, "Get out of France." And he says, "I can't, if I'm going to try to save France." Because Lafayette, he respected the monarchy, but what he wanted was he was hoping to get to something like a constitutional monarchy, which is very similar to what you have in the UK today. So he was for the people, but he didn't want to see necessarily the monarchy come to an end. So
even though England already had their doctrine,
correct. So he stayed. Well, Washington said, "Well, at least get the kids out." So he sent the kids over.
So Lafayette sends his children. How many children?
Well, at that time, 2 I think went over, but especially a girl. The name of the daughter is Marie. But George Washington goes over. So for better than 2 years, George and Martha Washington raise Lafayette's kids.
This is interesting. I want to jump ahead for one second.
At Mount Vernon.
I want to say something real quick. What many people don't know is that there is a huge picture of Lafayette in the representatives chamber.
Yes.
In our Capitol. So the next time you watch the State of the Union, or you watch joint members of Congress, or you go to D.C. and you go.
It's going to be gone for a little while, because if you look to your right on the first panel, you can see that's the famous painting that was commissioned by George Washington of Lafayette by Charles Wilson Peale. That painting will be at the Cabildo by April 9th.
This painting will be?
Yeah, it's coming.
But no, there's a painting in the house chamber.
Yes.
And so of Lafayette. And it's amazing that he's not even a U.S. citizen, or wasn't even American, wasn't he? And we have a painting of him because of his significance to us winning the American Revolution, and as a testament to him, helping us win the Revolution.
Well, at the creation of our country, he was made a citizen of the United States and offered lands, and I'll talk more about that specifically by Jefferson. But we're right. But that goes to show how close the relationship was.
So the Reign of Terror happens. Monarchs, he brings the kids over here, and what happens to Lafayette and Adrienne?
Well, he's trying to do all he can to basically calm everyone down. But at one point, he has to get out of France, where he goes to an area of he ends up in the city of Olmutz, and there's a famous prison there, and that Olmutz was considered Austria. It's probably now in the area. And I'm not the best on world geography. Not bad, but I think now it's what would be the Czech Republic. But that was considered the part of the Austrian Empire. Because you got to remember, Franz Joseph, the Emperor of Austria, his sister was Marie Antoinette. So everybody's intermarried. That's how they kept peace. That was.
So how did they not end up killing Lafayette during this?
Well, the Austrian Czechs take him as prisoner. Well, of course, those leading the Reign of Terror they want him extradited. And the Austrians knew if they released Lafayette, they would execute him. So Adrienne, being the very devout wife she is, and a very strong woman, she goes to the prison and insists that she be allowed to stay in the prison cell with her husband. And believe me, they had plenty of emissaries from the Reign of Terror at Olmutz, and they wanted to see was he being basically treated in what we call today like a country club prison. No, it was not. It was a damp, harsh prison cell. And he was treated well, but they had mold, there were health issues, and so the Austrians needed to do this to show the French, those leading the Reign of Terror, he's not getting special treatment. He's being treated like any other.
Did they like prisoner. Send a little picture and text it to him?
Yeah, exactly.
You know, a little JPEG.
They had their diplomats. Let's call it that. Their representatives.
Again, I'm going back
keeping
to
an eye on what was
we
happening.
don't think. I mean, like some people just don't. When you study history, a lot of people don't consciously think. I mean, they realize it's way back, and their cell phones weren't there, but they don't realize how hard this is because once again, those French have to travel to, Olmutz.
No, they have representatives there sending letters. So, and reporting. So, Adrienne insists, she was pleading for his release, and which I don't know what they would have done at that time, and maybe if she could have negotiated his release, they might have come to America. So she said, well, if you're not going to release him, then I want to stay with my husband. So she did for a long period of time, even took quite ill as a result. They explained to her it's complicated, and she said, "Yes, it's always with men. It's always complicated." But she didn't grasp. They understood if they release him, then they got to hand him over to the French officials, which they're going to execute him and her. So they stick it out for 5 years. He's in
prison.
He's
for
the prisoner
5
of
years?
Olmutz for 5 years. He spends in a prison. Finally, how did he get out? Napoleon, seeing him, worshiping, he admired. He arranged for his release. Once Napoleon comes into power, he gets Lafayette and Adrienne released, and they return to France under Napoleon's protection.
So how did Napoleon? What was Napoleon doing when Lafayette was over in America?
Well, he's an officer, a high-ranking officer under the regime that was running France, but they overthrew the reign of terror regime, including executing those who were over the regime. So now let's just call it for what it is. Napoleon seizes power and becomes ruler of France, supreme.
Now,
ruler
he was
of
not
France.
a monarch, so he comes in. So he comes in and takes over and kind of offers a new a new form
something
of
of a constitutional monarchy, but of course eventually Napoleon declares himself emperor, because the beginnings of what you would call the French Empire, or at least what Napoleon attempted to establish as a French Empire. And so he comes back to France, and of course immediately starts butting heads with Napoleon, because now Lafayette wants to see a true republic, very similar
to the one
he
fought
for in the United States. And
he sees Napoleon as not offering the freedoms.
I'll jump ahead and say something that's pretty kind of interesting. You'll see one of my pins here is on this side is our bicentennial pin that I designed and created, and you will see a phrase on there which is cur non, C-U-R, and the second word is N-O-N, cur non, and that it's Latin and it means why not. And that became Lafayette's adopted motto, and it's on his seal and shield at a coat of arms at Lagrange. And because people would always say, why must you? Lafayette was known for not taking the path of least resistance throughout his life. He was always a fighter for liberty and freedom. So, of course, when you take that path, you're going to butt heads.
So Lafayette comes back to France. He's butting heads with Napoleon. What happens?
He gets elected to as a sheriff, which is sort of like the French Senate.
Correct.
And he immediately creates the rights of man and the citizen, and I'm curtailing that.
Is that like Thomas Paine's
right?
Rights of Man?
What it becomes is it becomes basically the Declaration and the Constitution of France to this day. And when he began working on this, at this time, Jefferson is an ambassador, so He goes to Jefferson. It's a great story I read about Jefferson. In fact, Jefferson is writing a letter to Washington and saying, Lafayette's here. He came to him, and Lafayette says to Jefferson in Paris, says, I want to write this document very similar to what you did with the Constitution, and I want it to roll right into our Constitution. And Jefferson says to Lafayette, all right, well, great. He says, let me know when you're ready to do this. And Lafayette says, great, I'll be back tomorrow afternoon and we can get working on it. And Lafayette said, and he told Washington, that's when I realized the Marquis' time schedule and his clock is not like everybody else's. He was a no better time than the present kind of guy. Right. We're not going to take our time. Jefferson's like thinking, come back to me in a few days. We'll get working on it.
Right, yeah.
Great. I'll be back tomorrow. We're going to get working on this. And in 7 days, they iron this thing out, working all day, every day, day and night. They iron out the rights of man and the citizen, and that becomes, and it still serves to this day as like our Articles of Federation. For France. So it establishes the Republic of France, the constitutional republic, and then of course the flag that we know, what is known, the U.S. flag is the stars and stripes, the French flag is the tricolor. You'll notice it's red, white, and blue. Lafayette designed the French flag that we have today, wrote some of the words in a poem that became La Marseillaise, which is the French national anthem. So his footprint or thumbprint is everywhere in the history of France, from the Napoleonic era all the way to present day.
It's very interesting. So here's somebody as a young man had freedom and liberty and the passion for it welling up in
great wealth
and great wealth in his soul. And could not do it in France at the time simply because of the monarchy, but went to America, did it for America.
Yes.
Has a great. And how long was he in America during his time from South Carolina to the time he left?
76 through 80, 85, 83, 80. I'm sorry. I think 83.
Was it 81?
Well, no, at 1781 here. That's Yorktown.
Okay.
Right. And they still had a couple more years of the Revolutionary War.
So 1776
right.
to 18.
There's so many dates. I think 1783 was when he decided to.
So he's here for 7 years.
Yeah.
His wife's just like, la da 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 da. I'll do the dishes myself. This is. And
famous Richard Henry Lee, who was one of the signers of the Declaration, said he left behind him a most beautiful young wife to fight in the American wilderness for American liberty.
See, this shows the testament
right.
of true passion for freedom,
right.
and not just the will to fight for it, but the will to sacrifice
right.
your life, not only for freedom and liberty, but imagine, if you will, knowing had he not done, like we talked about a few minutes ago, his passion as a young man and individual has led to not only the freedoms and liberties and prosperity we have here in America, but how many times has America come to the aid of other countries throughout its history,
as I say,
to be able to fight for freedom? All because Lafayette, the spirit of freedom welled up inside of him.
I often say, without Lafayette, we might still be speaking with British accents.
Or worse, Russian.
Right. Well, I think, everybody says, what do you think would have happened? We would have probably become very much like Canada or Australia. We would have been part of the British Commonwealth, which you have a great degree of independence, but you're still part of the British system.
Right.
And they would, and I can say that with confidence, because why would they have just let us go?
So was Lafayette, when he recreated their Constitution, was it like the one that was written in England or Great Britain years before that?
No, the rights of man and the citizen is more like a close comparison to the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Federation of the
But
Constitution.
France doesn't have the Second Amendment like we have in ours.
No, not per se. There's reference to it. I encourage people just to Google it and pull up the document.
Okay,
and read it.
so as we wrap up here with this little story of Lafayette and his ties to America, how does so he obviously lives. Napoleon brings him back in, and he's now button heads with Napoleon. What happened from there?
Well, of course, Napoleon, falls. I mean, he's first defeated, and then a second time, and he's permanently exiled. And at that point, the Napoleonic rule is over with. But one of the things that Lafayette strongly emphasized, it was an absolute requirement as far as he was concerned, when he did the rights of man and the rights of man and the citizen, is he was, first of all, he was a staunch abolitionist. In fact, there's a reference on one of these panels that he was to a great degree disappointed that when he returned in 1824 that America had not made enough strides in progress on freeing the slaves and abolishing slavery. So much to the point that someone said, he said, if he would have known that within 50 years after 1776 that Negroes were not freed, that he might have reconsidered and never come across to fight for us. That's how staunch of an abolitionist he was. He was also a staunch advocate for the rights of women, especially protecting women and their rights of property. So when Napoleon is constructing the Napoleonic Code, for the first time, Lafayette tells Napoleon the word of property, community, community property. That term had never been heard of until Lafayette puts that bug in Napoleon's ear, that they have to give rights to protecting women's ownership, especially when their husband dies in estates and so forth. Right.
That was also in the 12 Pillars of Rome.
Right. So he was big on women's rights, and the last thing is he was just as strong of an advocate for the freedom and protection of Native Americans. So much that when he's on the tour, Native Americans had heard about his coming, and they traveled even hundreds of miles to find the path or the journey, the route, let's call it, that he was traveling to meet up with him. One of my two favorite stories on the entire 13-month tour that he did over the 6,000 miles was as he reached the Chattahoochee River at what is now Fort Benning, which now Fort Moore. He crosses the Chattahoochee to go to about a mile over on the other side of the river to what was then a frontier fort, Fort Mitchell. And the Creek Indians, who were defeated and even at some points decimated by Andrew Jackson in the French Indian Wars, those who still survived heard about Lafayette's coming, and they knew what a defender he was of their rights. When Lafayette comes off the skiff at the Chattahoochee River, he was in a chair on the boat. The Creek Indians picked him up and carried him the entire mile to Fort Mitchell because they did not want to allow his feet to touch the ground. That's how much they revered. So
you bring up two things here that I've alluded to on other shows before. I talk about American history and we look at. I always talk about how freedom runs in our DNA, and I believe that as humans, freedom is a part of our DNA. We don't realize it, but in many people throughout history, it comes out. And that's something that I believe that Lafayette has a strong sense of course, because of all this. And of course, when it wells up like that, you want freedom for others. But two things that I've also talked about is, one, weren't the Indians recruited by the British to help fight on the side of the British?
Both sides. I mean, that was a group that both sides went after. The British try to sway, and did. And then on the American side, the American colonists were able to sway some of the tribes to fight with them, and in some cases even eventually switch over. So it was, and again, you talk about the term double spy. I mean, that was common among a lot of the Indian scouts.
So I didn't know that Americans used the Indians during the American Revolution,
Yes.
but I did know that the British used the Indians against Americans during the Revolution. But also, on another side note...
Because remember, there were warring factions between the Indian tribes. So what's the old saying? The enemy of my enemy is my ally. Yeah. So some of the tribes sided with the colonists in the Continental Army.
So the other thing to point out, too, is, and this is what we don't realize, and this is a deep dive, and I won't go into it right now, but just to touch base on it, is... that a lot of people think of our founding fathers as being racist because they had slaves, or that at that time frame that the people at that time were racist because they had slaves, when most of people that had slaves at that time, it was generational. They were born into slavery themselves.
Well, people today have a depiction of slavery in what they call the antebellum South. That wasn't what slavery was like on the eastern coast and through most of the 13 colonies. Maybe a little bit more so in like the Carolinas, but
we're not defending it.
Right.
We're not defending it all.
It was just
historical.
Life was different. It was a different in culture and environment back then. Slaves were a little bit more revered and taken care of. Who were treated extremely harshly was those who came over in servitude.
So there were many that were there were whatever the percentage was, there were slaves that were treated very poorly and horribly in horrible conditions. And again, you're not giving a pass that there were some that were treated better, and you're not trying to make it sound like it was the right thing to do. We're just talking about, historically speaking, that there were slaves that were treated differently because of who owned them. And the reason I say it that way is, at the time, George Washington didn't grow up and say, I want to own slaves. He was, his father owned slaves. His grandparents, all these colonists, it
was already the established economic culture. Right.
What I also like about your story, and I'm going to research this a little bit more, is that Lafayette really injected some of these words or his thoughts into, whether it's George Washington or whoever it was at the time, because what I found in studying about making the Constitution is that our founding fathers knew when they created the Constitution that they weren't going to be able to free the slaves in it. So a lot of people, well, the Constitution doesn't talk about, our founding fathers didn't free the slaves, but our founding fathers, there's things in the Constitution, for a deeper dive at another time, that laid the groundwork or the stepping stone.
Right. Well, it's like Jefferson said, as they're debating for their independence, the snake of slavery was coiled around their ankles. They knew that it was a concession, that there was no way the Carolina representatives, delegates, were going to go along with the war for independence unless slavery was kept off the table. Bottom line. Right. So, and even then, the delegates from the Carolinas were not crazy about getting into this war against the crown. So it took a lot of negotiation and compromise to get to. So that's the reason why it was left.
When they say, well, all men are created equal, they were laying the groundwork
for the future. Absolutely.
Future, abolition of slavery, but we don't see it that way because
and of course back then it was very commonplace that owners of slaves, it was in their will that when they passed away that they were freed, if not beforehand. So,
but what's interesting to me is I did not know that Lafayette was so much of an abolitionist. So I would love to have known the conversations between Lafayette and George Washington and Jefferson, and
probably very delicate. When you're raised for the military from a young boy to 19, you learn diplomacy very well. So I'm sure they may have had some discussions on it, but it would have been very private and nothing in public that where Lafayette would have risked embarrassing Washington or putting him in an awkward position. I think, in other words, I think Lafayette knew his place. He was a military officer. He was not going to discuss politics.
So let's talk as we wrap up here, John. Let's talk about. Is there anything on these boards that we have left out? I'm gonna put the Zoom back out, and so that the people can.
Well, probably the more important
again.
as we come up on the bicentennial, as you'll see here, it says the guest of the nation, 13 months, 24 states, 6,000 miles. Lafayette triumphantly returns, and the term rock star status is an understatement for Lafayette. He was, people by the tens of thousands came to see him speak because he was famous. They knew people appreciated what he did, the risk and sacrifice that he made for our freedom, not his.
Right.
Remember that he could have stayed home in France and lived a very cushy life.
And when he cushy until the Reign of Terror, but and when he came over here, this is after he spent 5 years in prison.
Correct.
So
he did not have any. To say that he did not have an easy life is very accurate.
Did he lose his wealth during the Reign of Terror? Did they? So he's in prison.
The short answer is yes, but of course Napoleon reestablished those who were still alive. But he regained. The wealth. Let's say the only wealth he had was just the estates, the land, and he became a very successful farmer. He was a very good self-made agricultural engineer, and he came up with some very good, very efficient farming techniques that he was able to regain, much of his wealth.
All right, so continue where we.
So here he comes back. Congress commissions him as the guest of the nation. They help fund a lot of the tour. They even had a carriage made especially to travel with him, which I'll talk a little bit about in a second, since we have a Lafayette exhibit that is going to take place at the Cabildo, premiering with our gala on Wednesday, April 9th. But so he's making his way down south, and he's in Mobile, and at that time New Orleans was a seat of government, for the state. So that's the state capital. So the mayor and the governor get together and put together funds which amounted to about $450,000 in today's dollar value, which was quite a bit, probably more than it was put out anywhere. Lafayette, for the most part, on all his stops, and there were many, was just for a day or two, sometimes just for a few hours. He stopped in New Orleans longer than any other town. And when I say a stop, I mean a stop where from the moment he arrives to the moment he leaves, there's just one meeting, one event, dinner, banquet, party, ball, one after the other for 5 days straight. Yes, he was in Washington, D.C. for better than a month, but that was through the winter. There was only 1 or 2 days of parties and balls. Yeah. Right. And then he spent a couple of weeks in Monticello with Jefferson, where for the most part they spent their time twice clearing out Jefferson's wine cellar. You have a Frenchman. Of course, it's well known how Jefferson was was a wine master and loved wines, and of course you got a Frenchman, and Frenchmen love to drink wine. So they did a lot of drinking together. But when it comes to actual official stops and activities, he's in New Orleans longer, which, of course, now that brings me back to me trying to formulate and do this. I'm thinking I'm only going to have to worry about 1 day, 1 night, and then I read, oh, crap, he was here for 5 days. So now I've got a major event on my hands. So Alan Hoffman is the president, our current president of the American Friends of Lafayette. Alan was the one who 20 years ago, about 20 years ago, he took the diary and log of Colonel Auguste Levasseur, who was Lafayette's personal secretary, who traveled with him on all 13 months, 6,000 miles, and kept a log. Alan took Lavasseur's journal and translated it from French to English. And yes, you can purchase it on Amazon. So that became my Bible. That was my reference as to, I said, okay, let me see what Lafayette did. And he did a lot of things in New Orleans. A lot.
Did he go to Bourbon Street?
Right, yeah, right. I'm sure he did. I'm sure he did because he traveled. They said they put candles, they decorated the city and lit it up, and he went up and down all the streets of the French Quarter. So I'm sure at one point he was doing a slow carriage ride down Bourbon Street.
A little tour.
But
he had the tour.
So, of course, we cannot possibly do everything. So I'm just going to sort of emulate a little bit of what he did. So when Lafayette, the mayor and the governor commissioned a welcoming committee to go and fetch Lafayette. So they arrived there was a lot of letter writing going on, a lot of post dispatches taking place, and that's how they sort of kind of tracked where he was and did their best dead reckoning guessing where he could be. So they charge Armand Duplancher. I know authentically it's Duplancher, but I know a lot of the Duplanchers down here simply say Duplancher. But he is the owner of Magnolia Mound Plantation, which is in Baton Rouge. It's on Nicholson, only about maybe 4 blocks from Tiger Stadium.
Right.
You've probably seen it and passed it many times. That white house up on the hill, with the magnolia trees in front, that was his home. Well, remember, he served, Duplancher served for several months as an aide-de-camp under Lafayette. And when Congress and Jefferson made Lafayette a citizen, and here's a little bit of trivia most people don't know. Did you know that Thomas Jefferson offered Lafayette to be the first governor of Louisiana?
I did not know this.
And, of course, he had to respectfully turn him down because at that time, Lafayette's trying to help rebuild France post-Reign of Terror. But Congress granted a lot of land to Lafayette through Louisiana, Florida, and like the Florida parishes all the way into current day. That was current day Florida. So Duplancher was a good friend of Lafayette's and served, I'll call it his land agent. So Duplancher was overseeing Lafayette's assets and arranged for sales of his assets. So they knew each other quite well during the time when when Duplancher was an officer directly under Lafayette during the American Revolution. So they figured what better person to go and get Lafayette. So Duplancher goes and meets Lafayette. Has to wait a few days for him in Mobile and Gulf Shores. So they board the Natchez, the steamboat Natchez, and they come to Louisiana. The typical route for the boats to travel back then was through coastal dead reckoning. They would just follow along the coastline. So you're going along the coast of Mississippi, Ship Island, Biloxi Island, and you come around like through Chandeleur, and you come up, you see the mouth of the Mississippi River, and you come up the river. Well, the captain of the Natchez decided he was going to save time and just cut straight across the open Gulf. That was a mistake. They had horrendous weather, terrible thunderstorms. Levasseur describes great swells, and you got to remember this is a flat bottom boat. Flat bottom boats do not do well in open waters with great swelling. So they're really made for rivers or hugging along the shoreline. Mm-hmm. So they thought they were going to die. That's how bad it was. But somehow, through the grace of God, as Levasseur described, they made it to Main Pass, and they made their way up the river, and they drop anchor right along. They moor along the side of the Mississippi River on the east bank at what is now Braithwaite. And there was a gentleman, his name's escaping, but got a skiff, came across and met and had dinner with Lafayette late that evening on the evening of of April 9th. The very next day, they go upriver. And right after lunch, they arrive at the Chalmette battlefield. So Lafayette first steps foot in Louisiana in Chalmette at the battlefield. And, of course, there is a contingency waiting for him. The governor comes at
what
that
if the house? I wonder if there are other historical. Remember
what is now the Beauregard House? Yes,
yeah.
that's there. Right. And they had to seek refuge because the weather was horrible. In fact, it was terrible weather and raining the entire visit of all 5 days for Lafayette. They rarely got a break from the rain. So they had to move the outdoor festivities into the Beauregard House. And at that the new governor, who'd only taken office a few months, was Henry Johnson, who was the first, let's call it American, Anglo-American, because the previous governors were all French. So the immediate governor was Jacques Villeray, who was from St. Bernard Parish, and of course Roger Villeray, who I know you know very well, past Louisiana Republican Party chairman, is a direct descendant. And but they were all there. They were all Villeray, and all of them were there to welcome Lafayette. And from there he was taken by carriage that the Congress had commissioned for him, and they went to what is then Place d'Armes, now Jackson Square, and they built a almost 6-story arch, very remnant of the Arc de Triomphe, like in Paris. That was a common thing back then. When big celebrities came to your town, they erected this major arch.
So where is this arch?
Exactly where the statue of Andrew Jackson is today in Jackson Square.
So they took the arch down at some point.
Oh, yeah. It was basically constructed, I guess, when describing it, it's like listening to them describe the construction of a Mardi Gras float. It was wooden framed, canvas, a few bricks, but it was painted and made to look like it was stone. And it was, massive. It was probably 30 feet across in the opening.
Almost like when Pope John Paul visited New Orleans, they built a little temporary place for it.
They called them welcoming arches, so, and that was very commonplace. Other towns that welcomed Lafayette did the same, but I am told, of course, nobody built an arch as big and grand as we did here in New Orleans.
I love this. So he comes back, he visits for 5 days. And we're here where we are now, where we're celebrating his return. Proverbial.
Right. Well, when he leaves New Orleans, he gets back on the Natchez, and he goes up to Baton Rouge. And it took about 24 hours for the Natchez to get up to Baton Rouge. He only made a quick 1-day stop in Baton Rouge, and then went on upriver to Natchez, Mississippi, and then on eventually to St. Louis. But Levasseur writes that when the general, and that's how he preferred to be addressed. Some people, of course, still addressed him as Marquis, but he preferred, because by that time the nobility was a dying thing, right. And he preferred to be addressed as General. So Levasseur writes the general slept the entire 24-hour journey because he was just exhausted from all the parties and the balls and the events and the banquets. So that might have been, I tell people, I think that's when the city of New Orleans established its reputation as a party city.
I love this. So it's interesting to me, and that we don't have time for this right now because we're going to be wrapping up here. I know I said that a few minutes ago, but we got to start wrapping up in a second, is as he gets to each town, as he's traveling each town, like here he gets off the river, off the steamboat. It's like, who arranged for him to have a carriage to the next place, and right. How did he get, right. And where they arrange, how do they, there's not TripAdvisor at that point, and there's not a Waze.
Well, of course, by the time he makes his way to New Orleans and Baton Rouge, you had some representatives from St. Louis, from Natchez and St. Louis. They were waiting for him, so they just sort of passed him on to the next group. So that brings us to now, so what are we doing to commemorate as much as possible what Lafayette did? Well, on Wednesday, we're going to cheat. He arrived on April 10th at the battlefield. But on the evening of Wednesday, April 9th, and we're trying to get ahead of the crowds with the French Quarter Festival, we're going to be at the Cabildo with what we call the 1825 Gala. And remember, Lafayette stayed at the Cabildo that was the House of Lafayette, as the local newspapers dedicated it, and he slept in the they stayed in the Salle Capitular, which is the room where the Louisiana Purchase was right. Signed 21 years earlier. So he welcomed hundreds of guests, VIPs during that time, and slept in his bed in his chamber was at the Cabildo. So we're going to have a ball, and we are encouraging Regency period. If you watch the what's the series, Bridgerton, that's the Regency period. So we're Jane Austen. That's all. We encourage Regency period attire if you want to come in costume for the 1825 ball. We have special guests. Laurent Billy, he is the French ambassador to the United States. He will be at our gala. General Vincent de Kitzpater. He is the head general in France of the military. He is the attaché to the United Nations and to the U.S. Defense Department. He is coming down. Mrs. Benson, Gail Benson's going to be a special guest at our function. The governor has been invited. He says he's coming. We'll see. So we're going to have a lot of special people there, and it's going to be a great time. All the food, open bar, you can drink. We're going to have the Louisiana Vintage Dancers who are going to welcome people to teach you how to dance, Regency dance. And of course, we are going to have with us General Lafayette, and we're going to have, that's Mark Schneider. One of our sponsors, our generous sponsors, is the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. So if you've been to Williamsburg and you've seen Lafayette, you have seen Mark Schneider, and he's only doing this in a few cities with the American Friends of Lafayette.
And we're one of them.
And we're one of them. So we're going to have, they're paying for him. That's their contribution. On their dime, they're paying for his travel. So
jumping forward a little bit.
So we have the gala.
Quickly.
The very next day, we are going to we're going to go down to Dockville, which is the Doc Marrow Farm, and we are going to, for over 600 students, put on, Lafayette will be there to teach them about the importance of independence and liberty and preserving it. And then for 11:30, we're going to be out at the Chalmette battlefield where Lafayette arrived. And at 12 o'clock sharp, we are going to begin a ceremony where we're going to have General Kitzpater as the keynote speaker, and we're going to have a lot of pomp and circumstance to officially welcome Lafayette back to New Orleans. And yes, Lafayette knows it is the year 2025. He has sort of time traveled 200 years into the future.
It's his bicentennial.
Right, to be at his bicentennial. So, and then when we leave the battlefield at a little after 1, we're going to go take a 2-hour cruise on the steamship Natchez, as Lafayette didn't go down to the battlefield. And then
it's not the Natchez that he was on.
Right, no. Everybody has asked you, well, what is the Natchez he was on was what we call the second Natchez. The Natchez today that does the tours on the river is a perfect to scale replica of the third Natchez. Now, did they look different? No, they didn't. The third Natchez was built about 6 years after Lafayette visited New Orleans. And the way it is described is it's about 25 to 30% larger than the second Natchez, which is what Lafayette was on. But the second Natchez looked exactly like the current Natchez that does the river cruises right now, but just a little bit.
How do people find out about this event?
The best way to find out about our event is to go to our website. We have a really good website. It is www.afl, that's American Friends of Lafayette, AFL-Louisiana. So it's AFL-Louisiana.com. On the menu bar, you're going to see events. Click on that. You can scroll down day by day, all the events in great detail, what's going to take place at each event. And if any of the events sound like something you want to come to, the one at the Chalmette Battlefield is free and open to the public. But we also have in the menu bar tickets. Click on tickets, and you can scroll down and see day by day all the events for tickets you can purchase, or you can get a package, which will save you a little bit of money. And of course, some of the events on that Friday, we're going to get on the buses, and we're going all the way up to Baton Rouge. We're going to go with the Duplanche to Magnolia Mound. We're going to stop first for a short ceremony at the old Highland Road Cemetery, which is right across from the LSU Ag Center. Most people think it's somebody's backyard, but Duplanche and several French officers who fought in the American Revolution are buried there. So we are going to join up with the Sons of the American Revolution, the SAR, do a quick ceremony with laying a wreath, and we're going to drive 3 minutes over to Magnolia Mound, where Duplanche will welcome again his old general to Magnolia Mound. And when we leave Magnolia Mound at about 1:15, we're going to drive 5 minutes over to Old Town Baton Rouge, right behind the old Capitol. which is Lafayette Street. And there's the building there called the Tessier Building, which is now the oldest surviving building in the city of Baton Rouge. And Lafayette visited there, and we're going to recreate for an hour and a half, the events in the gathering and champagne toast.
Quite amazing, John.
And then Friday night, we're back in New Orleans, uptown in the Garden District, which, by the way, was the city of Lafayette before it incorporated into New Orleans. We're going to be at the Women's Opera Guild House because Lafayette went to 2 operas when he was in New Orleans. New Orleans back then was the place in the United States to be for opera. Most of your famous European operas made their American premiere in New Orleans. So there, we're going to have a little bit of opera in Lafayette at the Women's Opera Guild House. And Saturday, the big event. If you're going to come and enjoy the French Quarter Festival, go to Jackson Square at 10:30. By 10:30, make it 10:15. Lafayette is going to be with Lieutenant Governor Billy Nungesser on the main stage in Jackson Square. And at that point, Lafayette will address tens of thousands of people, just as he did 200 years ago, and he will address the people of New Orleans.
It's amazing. They had French Quarter Festival back then too.
Yeah, but well, yeah, it was called Lafayette's Visit, right? Exactly, and so that tells you, and it's free and open to the public as the French Quarter Festival is. So get out there by 10 o'clock if you want to make sure you get a spot in front of the stage to come and hear General Lafayette.
John, I can't thank you enough for all this time. I can't thank everybody else for listening in on all this, this time here, and I appreciate it. Again, this is more about an event than me. It was more about. The event is a celebration, but it was more about the significance of Lafayette had to America and our freedom.
One last thing, I'll close. One of the things that Lafayette did, it wasn't just all parties. And I thought this was important that he met with leaders of the big French families. And remember, at this point, Louisiana is a state for about, a dozen years? And there was still this sort of, let's call it resistance or hesitance for the French to embrace their new Americanism. So Lafayette basically met with many leaders of the French families and said, you're not Frenchmen anymore. You're Americans. You need to embrace this new sense of liberty and constitutional freedom. And that it still took a little bit of time, but he was definitely a big help in finally unifying the American, French, and Creole cultures to finally unite and come together.
I love this.
Yeah.
This is a great story. I ask everybody, please, if this is something that interested you and you felt like it really inspired you when it comes to freedom and liberty, then I'd ask you please to share the interview with somebody, share this podcast, share the video, or go online at the website and be able to
afl-louisiana.com
and find out how you can be a part, because it's going on all over America too. Find out a city near you that if you're in the tour, because this is while we talked about the New Orleans event, this is actually happening all over the United States.
At our website, you'll see on the menu bar there's a link to Lafayette200.org. Go there and you can see the map of how Lafayette right here followed the whole path. So if when he a couple of weeks after he left Louisiana, he was in Nashville. He spent 2 nights with Andrew Jackson at the Hermitage. And they're now, because of me getting with them, they didn't know about this. Now they're planning a big gala and ball at the Hermitage to reenact. Right. So wherever you are, especially if you're anywhere from the south, up east, Mississippi, Ohio Valley, there's a good chance you're not far from where there's going to be a Lafayette event. And Bill, the way I do a lot of speeches and lectures. The way I always end it is, and we do this in the American Friends of Lafayette, we say, Vive Lafayette.
I love it.
Vive Lafayette.
There we go. Thank you so much for your time. Please share the video.